And that had nothing to do with Arlington. That was right near it, but yes, he was a big man, so.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I know it's a beautiful sunny afternoon and you're stuck inside with us today. But we really appreciate Austin coming with us today and talking about some of the work they're doing at Quabbin and DCR. And I have a long history with DCR management, and I support us always trying to do better as we manage our woodland. So with that, Austin Gelinas. Thank you, Austin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Austin Gelinas. I'm a forestry assistant with DCR Division of Water Supply Protection, and coming up on being in this position for about a year. And my background is specifically in wildlife and fisheries, not so much the forestry side. So I've had to learn quite a bit in the last year. But I grew up in Orange, so I know plenty about the Quabbin area. Today I'm going to be talking about a pilot program that the Division of Water Supply Protection put into effect this past winter. It's known as the Forest Stand Improvement Program. And this program project is being done at Quabbin Reservoir, Wachusett, and Ware River. So it's all the same protocol, just the different areas, and it's all the same team. We just travel to each watershed as the work is needed. So the program's goals, the major goal is to improve forest resiliency in young forests, to increase the overall tree biodiversity, improve wildlife habitat, and climate resilience. And by definition, forest resiliency is the capacity of a forest to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage or stress and recovering quickly. So we're just looking overall for a healthier forest stand that can adapt to whatever hits it. Could be, a windstorm, an ice storm, pest diseases, that kind of thing. Our work specifically with the forest stand improvement is a part of that is also to reduce the stressors that threaten that resiliency. So that includes invasive insects, pathogens and diseases, deer and moose browse, forest fragmentation, and climate change. Just to give a little intro of the team, over on the left is our Forest Resiliency Coordinator, Christian Smith, out on the Prescott Peninsula. He acts as our kind of field supervisor. In the middle is me over at Berry Heath, cutting some white pine. And on the right is another forestry assistant, Patrick Maher, cutting a red maple coppice at Ware River. And that is the whole team. So what is forest stand improvement? It's a form of pre-commercial forest management used to improve vigor, composition, productivity, and quality of forest stands at the sapling stage of regeneration. And regeneration, just the reestablishment or regrowth of our forests after a disturbance. So it's essentially what the next generation of trees will be. So the improvement is we're looking for more diversity in our tree species. What we're seeing a lot of is a lot of our overstory has some oaks and hickories and sugar maple, but we're not getting a lot of regeneration in a lot of these areas. So our overall goal, I didn't touch anything.
Well, that's normal.
I don't know where. All right, fair.
Very lucky good.
So as I was saying, we're looking for the more desired tree species, our oaks, hickories, sugar maple, and other hardwoods. Not to say that, any of the other trees we don't want, but our white pine, red maple, and blackbird specifically are very abundant and they tend to take over a lot of the forest stands. So we're just trying to improve that diversity by reducing that competition from the faster growing species and more abundant species specifically. And without our intervention and removal of that competition, those species are more likely to be suppressed and die. So we're just trying to get ahead of that suppression before those trees get suppressed and die. Our big ticket trees specifically are oaks and hickories, as they're very valuable for local wildlife and are expected to become even more important as the change in climate causes them to expand their range northwards. So this is a pretty common example of the work we do. So we would go into a stand, in this case, it was mostly dominated by white pine. We would find, in this case, it was 4 white oak saplings, and then we would cut any of the white pine that were around it, either shading it out or close enough to it where they would be competing for water and nutrients. So now those white oak saplings have plenty of room to grow and hopefully don't succumb to some disease or something, but at least now they have a better chance of survival now that we went in and did that work. So why do our watersheds need FSI? And I'll probably refer to it as FSI throughout the presentation. That's just the forest stand improvement. It mostly has to do with our regeneration goals, because that's big on having a diversity of tree species. So we want, as many species as we can get over a certain amount of area. There is a goal of stems per acre and species per acre, but I don't know that number. That's kind of outside my realm a little bit. What we have been seeing is we do regeneration sampling to see what exactly is coming up in these areas. And these areas, for the most part, are timber harvested areas from a number of years ago. I'll get into that a little bit. But what we're seeing in these areas is that the regeneration is mostly black birch, white pine, and red maple. Very, very little oak and fewer hickory coming up in those areas. So, like I said, higher diversity equals more resilience to pests and diseases and whatnot. When they come through, like ash is having a pretty hard time right now with the emerald ash borer. So just having an overall higher diversity would make those stands more resilient to things like that. And this whole program began in collaboration with a white oak sapling release study conducted in Ware River by Jeff Ward. Previous research showed that this pre-commercial release of these trees, so reducing the competition for these more desired trees, lent itself to better or more growth and better survival of these species compared to not removing that competition. So that kind of jump-started this program. And currently, Jeff Ward is doing a study looking at how that specifically impacts white oaks to see if it has the same effect, because that research was done specifically on red and black oak. So he wants to see if that lends itself to white oak as well. So that's how this whole program started. Research has shown good results. So they started the program. Looking at some of the numbers, this is looking at the mean tree regeneration composition in Quabbin. I believe these sites were harvested between 1997 and 2008, and then the sampling was done from 2008 to 2023, and they did 2024, but I didn't have that data. In these openings, we're seeing 76% of our regeneration is black birch and white pine. So it's very well dominated from 1 or 2 tree species. And our target tree species, or our more desired ones, like our oaks, we have 2.7% scarlet oak, 1.5% red oak, 1.3% sugar maple, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very skewed towards those faster growing species, and that's what we're trying to level those numbers out. So there's just an overall higher diversity. Picture's a little blurry in this one, but this is looking at Wachusett. Again, same thing, it's very skewed towards the faster growing species. In this case, white pine, red maple, and black birch. Wachusett seems to be doing a little better in the oak category, have about 9% red oak regeneration and about 6% black oak regeneration. So it's doing a little better than Quabbin, but overall still want to even those numbers out overall. So how we go about actually assessing a site. So it needs to be a site that was harvested between the 8 and 20 year mark. After the 20 years of growth, the overstory is already established. So most of the work we would be doing wouldn't have much impact on the overall composition at that point. And the 8 year mark has been designated as anything below that, it's still all kind of establishing itself. So you won't get a full idea kind of what's regenerating in that area. Once a harvest is done, some years later, that 8 to 20 year mark, a forester will go in that cut area and will then determine whether our work is needed in that area. So specifically, they'll look, are the species we want there, and do they need our assistance in order to be, reduce that competition? Because there are some openings where we're having good oak regeneration, doesn't need our help, so we don't need to go in there, even though those oak are present. So if it needs our help and has the species we need, then they'll tag it as needing our work in there. These openings are typically between ½ acre and 2 acres large. Some are smaller, some are larger. All depends on kind of how the cut went a number of years ago. Then when it's determined if it needs our work, it's given a diversity improvement reporting point, which is just a single kind of data point. I'll show that in a minute. That has all of the data related to the work that the crew does directly in the field. So it would be the number of stems released, species, if invasive plants were present, the date of the work, the hours we worked, what watershed it was in, and then any other relevant notes that we think would be necessary for people to know. So we collect all of our data in an application called Field Maps. It's a map-driven application that just kind of acts as a database for various projects. In this case, this is how we accumulate all of our data. And in this picture specifically, there's 4 harvests. You have this one down here, you have this group up here, this over here, and then this kind of long area here. So there's 4 areas that were harvested for timber at some point in time. And then within those areas, there are smaller blocks, and those are the patch openings that we go to do our work. And each one of them is given a data. Yes.
Just so I know what I'm looking at.
Yep. I believe this is Prescott, yes.
And so those, and how you had access.
Mm.
Are you guys keeping those roads open so that you can get into the different parts?
The interior roads are maintained by our roads crew,
Yeah.
so they're always open, so we do make our
So you need to,
yeah.
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 Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, so each one of our openings there has a data point associated with it. So in this case, the color points are our reporting points, and they're color coded to indicate whether work is needed. It would be an orange dot, or the work is completed. That's the light blue dot. If it needs assessment, which is the purple dot, and if no work is needed, it's given a red dot. So it's very apparent to us where we need to go and what kind of work needs to be done. So in this case, we have a purple dot over here, so that would need assessment, and then the rest of these dots, all the work has been completed there. So that's the typical view we're looking at when we're going into the field to get to these areas. So getting more in depth about our methodology once we actually get into an area. First, we need to select the trees to be released, and needs to meet a few criteria. One, it needs to be the desired species that we want. It needs to be above the deer and moose browse height because they do quite a number on oak regeneration specifically. So we want it to be, above that line to give it the best chance of surviving. And then it needs to be vigorous, so it needs to be free of deformity, disease, or insect infestation. Then once a tree is selected to be released, and in this case, released is meaning saved. So it's the one we're saving. Yeah. Once a tree is chosen to be saved, the competing saplings that are encroaching on its crown, so shading it out, are removed. And in some cases, we do have larger trees that need to be removed. In some cases, we can't. Either it might have like a severe lean one way, a number of things, to where it could maybe fall on the oak we're trying to save or whatnot. So we end up girdling it, which is just cutting a ring around the tree and the trunk, cuts off the cambium, so there's no nutrient exchange from the leaves to the roots. It eventually starves the tree, so then it doesn't get any foliage, so then the sunlight can reach that oak or hickory or whatever we're trying to save. Common species that we cut are the white pine, red maple, and black birch. Are faster growing species, and they are very abundant in a lot of the areas that we're in. And there are also cases where we need to remove interfering native vegetation. So witch hazel, grape vine, and mountain laurel specifically. Witch hazel and mountain laurel can get very tall and grow very bushy and large. So there are some cases where we have oak saplings that are being shaded out by that native vegetation. So then we need to remove it in order to give it the best chance of surviving. Few examples. On the left is a white oak that was released at Quabbin Reservoir. It had a white pine sapling growing like into its canopy, so they were kind of growing into each other. So we had to remove that. Now it's got plenty of space to grow, plenty of sunlight, and overall reduced competition around it. And on the right is a white oak that was released at Watershed Reservoir. We had to cut down some black birch, red maple, and white pine, and those were all. This is kind of in the process of piling, but it was a neater looking pile than that at the end. So again, now it's got full sunlight, reduced competition, so it's got a better chance of making it at the end. A little more of the nitty gritty stuff. Every member of the team had to pass and go through the chainsaw safety training, specifically sponsored by DCR, make sure they know what they're doing with the saws as well as in a tree cutting situation. And we use electric chainsaws to fell the small trees, so there's no gas coming out with us, which helps with hauling it out because we do have to walk sometimes up to a mile out in the woods to these areas. So it's just the electric chainsaws with the batteries that we're hauling out. And typically the trees we're taking down aren't any bigger than 8 inches in diameter. So these saws have plenty of power to take those trees down. So there's no need for those bigger saws out there. And the trees remain on site to decompose. They provide food, cover, and habitat for various plants, animals, and fungi. And no heavy equipment is required for any of this cutting, so there's no skidders or trucks or anything like that going out in these areas. This is a better example of kind of how we repurpose what we cut down. We take the time to put it all in a brush pile again, so small mammals, birds, amphibians, etc., can utilize that for one reason or another. So we're not just kind of leaving a bunch of small cut wood on the forest floor after we're done. That's Patrick on the left, and that's just an example of one of the brush piles we had in Quabbin Reservoir. And this is just another example, and if you can see those stumps in the front, they're pretty small trees. So that's overall kind of how the program works, kind of the work we do. Does anybody have any questions regarding any of that? Before we get into the data?
What diseases are the oaks facing potentially?
I'm not too sure. I'm still fairly new to the forestry field, so I'm not too sure about diseases specifically with oaks.
Also, the age, like the thing.
I think you're saying the tree grade.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All right. So these are the results we got at Quabbin Reservoir. In Quabbin, they released 4,258 stems. 96% of those were oaks, hickories, and sugar maple, and then 4% were other species that were used to just improve site diversity. Some of the numbers, we had 1,100 white oak, almost 1,000 red oak, over 800 black oak, over 600 hickory, over 500 scarlet oak, and then a couple dozen sugar maples. And other species that we released included yellow birch, paper birch, ash, beech, poplar, spruce, hemlock, pitch pine, red pine, and sassafras.
Austin, how many acres did you cover while to get those numbers of trees done, you know?
It was roughly 126.
Okay, thank you.
So these are results from Wachusett Reservoir. So in Wachusett, we released 1,702 stems, 92% were those oaks, hickory, and sugar maple, and then 8 were others to improve diversity. We had over 500 red oak, over 500 white oak, over 200 black oak, over 100 scarlet oak, over 100 hickory, and a dozen and a half sugar maple in there. Other species included aspen, ash, red pine, cherry, yellow birch, pitch pine, beech, sassafras, hemlock, ironwood, and elm.
Just a quick question on that, is the red pine on the undesirable ones in there? Cause I noted, or did I mix that up initially? Cause I see it on the bottom to be released.
Yes, so the red pine, sorry, did you say, yeah, you said red pine, right?
Yeah, I was,
Yeah.
cause I thought red pine was one of them that were overtaking too, but I could have mixed up the pine.
That's white.
Okay, thank you, that's the clarification.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. And then some statistics for our crew specifically. So this season ran for about 3 months. So this is all the work we did was in a 3-month period. So we had a total of 51 field working days, covered about 125.5 acres. We had 628 person hours, 221 actual cutting hours, and the crew was able to cover a little over half an acre per hour, and we had about 47 stems released per acre. And overall, across the 3 watersheds, we released 5,961 stems. So that was a seasonal position, and Patrick and I were brought back on as forestry assistants for this spring and summer season. For other duties, not this program specifically, but we were able to monitor a handful of those sites to see how they were doing. And in some of them, we found that the trees had succumbed to ice and snow damage. We opened them up completely to whatever elements happen, so snow and ice damage is inevitable for some of them. I had mentioned we girdled some of the trees if they were too large, and we had mixed results with that. Some of them didn't respond to the girdling at all, and they just kept growing how they usually did. Some of them ended up dying off, but then we had some where they would rot at the cut, and then they snapped off and crushed the oaks anyway. Unfortunate, but that's just how it played out. At a lot of our older sites, so more of that 15 to 20 year range, we found that the oaks like to grow very tall and very thin, being supported by aspen or birch or whatever. So they kind of grew up in the branches, so they had no reason to kind of grow out to support themselves. And we experimented with releasing some of those just to kind of see what would happen. And they all, by the time we came back in the spring to monitor, they were all bent over due to the weight of the leaves of the acorns. Fortunately, we only kept that to a few individuals. The rest of them we're just going to keep the way they are for them to produce acorns and just overall help with the regeneration, but they won't grow into a mighty oak tree in the future. We also saw quite a bit of the canopy was growing in around our release trees. Even though we cut a lot of the competition around it, the trees more off to the sides were still growing over that tree and shading it out a bit. So we are going to experiment with larger openings around the tree to see if that will have any effect on how that canopy grows in after another season. But overall, the program and project have been successful, and currently we're measuring success qualitatively, which right now we're going into an opening, and if more than 50% of the stems that we released are still in good form and have enough sunlight, then we count that as a good release tree. That opening is seen as successful, and then overall looking at a harvest, if it's successful if it has more openings than not that meet those success criteria. So overall, it's been good, and we've seen good results so far. So what's next for the program? FSI will be a continuous component of forest management going forward. Over time, these harvests are going to either age out or will catch up with the work, and then there'll be a gap in between where it meets that 8-year point of us to do work. But we have been made aware that there have been over 200 sites identified in the Wachusett Reservoir that have either been tagged as needing an assessment or they require our work. I have heard that could be upwards of 250 to 300, but that's not confirmed yet. So we have plenty of work for the next winter, 2 or 3. We're also going to start experimenting with openings younger than that 8-year mark, specifically for white oak resilience, because we're seeing when they fit in that window of the 8 to 20, they're usually already suppressed at that point, or we've seen a majority of them that have already died at that point. So we're hoping to get in the 5 to 6 year range to hopefully release those white oak a little sooner than the rest, and hopefully give a better chance of survival. Along with all that work, we're going to incorporate non-commercial forest management improvement. So that'll be invasive plant control, tree planting, removal of interfering native vegetation, coppice thinning, and sanitation cuts. I don't know too much about this aspect because it hasn't been kind of drawn up yet to us. And for those that don't know, a coppice is if you cut a tree or the tree falls, it'll shoot up a bunch of stems from that point and they grow, and that's referred to as a coppice. So coppice thinning would just be us going in, looking at a coppice and selecting the best 1 or 2 stems out of that group. Because if they all start to grow, you get a lot of issues with the growth at a later point. And then sanitation cuts is just removing any trees that are inflicted with a pest or disease to stop from spreading to any of the nearby trees. So that's all going to be incorporated in the program at some point, but I don't have any timeline in that at all. A couple projects I wanted to highlight that are kind of FSI adjacent, but not specifically the work I've talked about. We have 2 projects kind of similar nature, the New Salem Barrens and Berry Heath. These are both pine pitch oak barren communities, and pitch pine are pyrophytes, so they're fire dependent for regeneration and germination. So fire needs to be run through at some point, which DCR is currently doing on some of their lands. So our team was tasked with going in and removing any incompatible species that could act as ladder fuel for when the fire goes through. And that's usually white pine and red maple, and those, again, more abundant, faster growing species. And then we have the snake hibernacula in Hardwick. It's a huge stone pile from the construction of a building that DCR did a number of years ago. I don't know exactly when it was.
Yeah, that was the construction of the aqueduct between Quabbin and Watershed.
Okay.
So that was part of the shaft. Or whatever, shaft.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, after that pile was put there, our biologists went there at some point and found that black racers were using that area. So we try to keep it clear of all vegetation for the snakes to use that rocky area. So our team went in and just cut down it was mostly white pine and birch again, to open up that habitat for the snakes to use again. Some future projects that have just been kind of said to me in passing is the tiger beetle project on Prescott Peninsula. There's a naturally occurring kind of sandy rocky area that has been tagged as either potential tiger beetle habitat or it has been seen to be used by tiger beetles. And the idea with that project is for us to go in and remove some of the maturing pine that's completely shading out that sandy rocky area. Another project is some ladder fuel reduction in Quabbin Park. There's going to be a timber harvest there within the next couple years, and we're tasked. There's a slope that no equipment can get to for them to do like their whole effective removal. So our team will go in and remove any of those mid-story trees that they don't want. Again, I believe it's a pitch pine habitat, so it's removing anything that would impede with that fire going through there. And then we may have some work on the islands. Again, some of those communities are fire dependent as well, so we would just be tasked again with going in and removing any incompatible trees, mostly white pine. If and when they put fire through there, all in passing, but some interesting future projects we might have. And that's all I have for you. Any other questions?
Hemlocks there. Hemlocks affected by. The hemlocks, Quabbin, roughly speaking, problems with disease.
Honestly, I haven't taken too much of a look at hemlocks. That would be more of a question for one of our foresters.
Yeah.
I don't do any like surveying of insects or any diseases, so I can't speak on that.
Are they bringing rattlesnakes, black racer habitat on Harvard?
No,
No.
they are not. It's just that project is just to keep it how the habitat is for the snakes that are there to use.
Yeah, the hybrid act is interesting because they wouldn't do it today, but when they built the act, back in the 1920s, they put all the stone that they took out of the tunnel and dumped it on a pond. So they actually filled this whole pond up with this water, which actually made for a perfect hibernacula for the snakes, because it's probably 60 feet deep of stone. And all those voids and stuff allow the snakes to get down below the frost line, and it's very cool and damp down there. So you have a good place for all the winter. And in fact, 30 years ago, there was as many as 40 or 50 black races that you find there in the springtime using that habitat. They've been persecuted pretty badly over there, and a lot of snakes were actually killed by idiots. And but anyway, there's still a few around, and trying to keep that habitat viable for the ones that are left.
What was killing the black racers?
People. Idiot.
Just a quick comment, your presentation was awesome, like so informative, so good. Didn't want to end, and the pictures were really helpful too. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah,
How did you end up with this, I guess, fire triculture, or it's dominated completely by 2 or 3 species? It's just a lack of management for the last, I think, 1 or 2 years.
that's a good question that, again, I can't speak on too much. I'm not privy too much to the kind of foresting history of the Quabbin, so unfortunately can't speak to that too much.
So for me, just to understand what the future is, you're gonna continue to be doing the cutting and, what we're calling them, saving the desirable trees.
Oh,
Yes.
rescue.
So that's gonna happen this winter, and the next winter, and the next winter, and you're gonna continue monitoring to see if that's a successful way to save the good trees and kind of thin out some of the ones that are trying to take over.
Yeah, it'll continue as long as we have sites that meet that 8 to 20 year range.
You know what?
If we have sites that meet that 8 to 20 year range of them being harvested. So there will be a point where there's no more work to be done in terms of this project. It'll just be monitoring those sites, and then eventually, timber harvesting will continue. So then those sites will eventually reach that 8 to 20 year mark, and then we'll do work in those areas, and it'll just continue.
And just experiment at the same time to see.
Yes, yeah,
And yes, your presentation is great.
thank you. All right.
All right, sure, thanks, guys. Now, a little bit of Japanese questions, and, it really is a lot like feeding a garden, you know what I mean, it's the same kind of principle. We try to pick out what you have for crop species and the idea with most of this is really to, have a good diversity of species. We're gonna have plenty of white pine, we're gonna have plenty of blackbird, but to make sure we don't lose those other components of the forest. That's so important for wildlife and for so many other things, so, it's kind of cool work. I'm